Imagine a child, born in the dim, flickering light of a broken street lamp, to a mother who hasn't slept properly in weeks, and a father whose soul quietly eroded after years of low-wage labor and silent humiliation. This child enters the world already shackled, not by physical chains, but by invisible systems more enduring: economic determinism, psychological programming, and cultural inertia. Before they've spoken their first word, the rules of their life are written. But here's the paradox. In a world screaming about opportunity, upward mobility is sold as a birthright. Yet somehow the poor remain poor. Not always, but overwhelmingly. The question is not just why, but how this cycle has become so perfectly self-reinforcing. There is no shortage of explanations. Politicians say it's policy. Economists say it's structure. Psychologists say it's mindset. But what if the roots stretch deeper into the architecture of power itself? Into the psychology of control? Into a Machiavellian understanding of how systems maintain dominance not through overt violence, but through subtle indoctrination and the strategic use of despair? Niccolò Machiavelli, the cynical mastermind behind The Prince, argued that a ruler need not be loved or even just only feared enough to maintain control. But what if fear today isn't found in iron chains or gallows, but in the quiet suffocation of poverty, in the gnawing dread of rent due, the shame of food stamps, the invisible weight of hopelessness? What if fear now wears the mask of economic necessity? This is the new Machiavellianism. Not a prince dominating his subjects with brutality, but a system perpetuating its own hierarchy by scripting failure into the lower classes. It doesn't need to punish rebellion. It ensures rebellion never happens because the poor are too busy surviving to resist. This is not conspiracy. It's conditioning. From the earliest moments of childhood, poor individuals are taught to internalize scarcity. The television tells them they are missing out. The school system teaches them obedience, not critical thought. Society subtly implies their worth is tied to income, their dignity to consumption. This, too, is a form of warfare, a quiet psychological colonization of the spirit. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For the poor, the unconscious is shaped by constant exposure to inferiority, by systems designed to humble, not empower. They don't choose poverty as fate, but they are born into a psychic landscape that makes escape almost mythical. Because here's the sinister brilliance of it. When you trap a person long enough, you don't need the cage anymore. Their mind becomes the jailer. They doubt themselves before they apply. They self-sabotage because they believe they are unworthy. They chase fleeting comforts, lotteries, consumer goods, cheap dopamine, because real transformation seems unreachable. They are told to dream but punished for trying. Hope is weaponized as a false carrot, always dangled, never delivered. This is where power thrives, not by oppression, but by corrosion. Not by force, but by fatigue. The system doesn't need to stop you. It needs only to wear you down until you stop yourself. So we ask, what does it truly take to escape a prison built from the inside out? The answer is not simply work harder or think positive. That's the lie sold by those who've never tasted real desperation. The path to liberation is deeper, darker, and more treacherous, requiring a rebellion not just against poverty, but against the psychic architecture poverty constructs. And so we begin by deconstructing how the game was rigged before the first move was made. In the next section, we'll dive into the psychological frameworks that keep poverty alive, not through material deprivation alone, but by sculpting the very self-image of the poor to fit the mold of permanence. You don't have to chain someone to control them, just convince them they'll never leave. This is the genius of modern poverty. It doesn't need guards, prisons, or walls. It only needs belief systems, ideas as invisible as air, yet heavy enough to crush a human soul. The poor are not just economically deprived, they are psychologically engineered to remain so. Think of the child again, now slightly older. She walks past wealth every day. Luxury cars, shining storefronts, smiling faces on billboards promising a better life. But she also walks into a crumbling school building, where teachers are underpaid and classrooms overcrowded. She hears subtle messages: be realistic, That life isn't for people like us. Work hard, stay quiet. Maybe you'll survive. Survival becomes the goal. Not creation, not ambition, not self-actualization, just endurance. This is where the psyche is branded. Repetition becomes internalization. After enough years of being told that success is distant, improbable, even dangerous, the poor internalize a script that isn't theirs, but one they begin to perform unconsciously. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote, "A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. That is the quiet horror of poverty. It limits not just choices, but the will itself, the very capacity to imagine something different. It narrows the psychological landscape until possibility itself is exiled." You see this in subtle but powerful ways. A brilliant mind who refuses to apply for college because no one in their family ever did. A gifted artist who stops drawing because art doesn't pay the bills. A worker who stays in a toxic job for decades because any risk feels worse than slow decay. These choices seem personal, but they are the echoes of something older and darker, generational beliefs passed down like genetic code. We don't belong in that world. That's for other people. You're lucky to even have what you have. These are not merely phrases, they are spells. Spoken long enough, they become curses. And then comes the paradox. When an opportunity does arise, it's often met with fear, resistance, or even self-destruction. The poor are taught to fear not just failure, but success itself. Because success means entering foreign territory, losing the comfort of shared suffering, confronting imposter syndrome so deep it feels like betrayal. They are told, climb, but never taught, here's how. And so, when they stumble, the world says, see, you weren't meant to rise. This is no accident. A stable hierarchy needs psychological anchors. If you want to keep people from rising, you don't need to hold them down, you need to make them hold themselves down. That's the true brilliance of this system. It weaponizes self-doubt. The media plays its part. Movies glorify rags to riches stories, but always with a touch of fantasy. Real-life inequality is depoliticized. Poor characters are often portrayed as either saints or fools, rarely as full, complex humans crushed by design. The message is clear. If you haven't made it, you didn't want it badly enough. But that's a lie. And lies this deep must be excavated, not argued with. It begins with awareness, naming the mechanisms, understanding how years of deprivation become a psychological blueprint. That poverty isn't just what's in your bank account, it's what's carved into your sense of worth. If we are to escape the poverty trap, we must go beyond economics. We must descend into the caverns of the mind where fear masquerades as realism, and shame wears the mask of humility. In the next section, we'll explore how power systems actively cultivate this psychological terrain, not just passively, but through calculated structures designed to preserve hierarchy. We will follow Machiavelli's shadow as it moves through education, labor, media, and culture, embedding loyalty, fear, and stagnation beneath the surface of daily life. If you want to control a society, don't threaten its people, educate them. Or more precisely, miseducate them. Condition them to obey, not to question. Train them to follow, not to lead. Teach them to memorize, not to think. And in doing so, make them believe the system they were born into is the only one possible. This is how modern power operates, disguised in the clothing of opportunity, yet engineered to keep its underclasses perfectly in place. And at the heart of this maintenance machine are three institutions: education, labor, and media. Together, they form the unholy trinity of economic stasis. A trinity Machiavelli, if alive today, would not just recognize, he would admire. Let's begin with the classroom. Public education in impoverished areas doesn't create dreamers. It creates workers. It teaches the poor to show up on time, follow instructions, take standardized tests, and fear authority. Not because teachers are malicious, most are heroic under impossible pressure, but because the system demands obedience over originality. That's by design. As early as age 5, children are taught not to question the curriculum, but to conform to it. Independent thought, creativity, subversion, these are threats, not goals. And when one does rebel, the system punishes. Detention, suspension, labels. The troublemaker becomes difficult, emotional, unfocused. And soon, another body quietly shuttled into the pipeline from poor schools to poor jobs to poor lives. In the words of Aldous Huxley, the propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human. The poor are not just economically segregated. They are intellectually sterilized, not by force, but by the slow starvation of aspiration. Then comes the workplace. Here, Machiavelli's principles evolve. The goal is no longer merely fear, but fatigue. Imagine waking at 5:30 a.m. to take 2 buses to a job that barely pays minimum wage, only to be watched by managers trained not to inspire but to enforce. Rules are abundant, breaks are short, surveillance is constant. Dissent is crushed not with violence, but with termination and the quiet threat of starvation that follows. And yet, the cruelest part? These workers are told they are lucky to have that job. Gratitude becomes a leash. There's no time to think, no energy to resist. Just a daily grind that bleeds the soul while whispering, "This is what life is." Even the thought of escape becomes exhausting. And then, when the shift is over, when the mind is at its weakest, enter the third arm of the machine, media. The screen tells them what they're missing. Luxury, power, sex, success, forever out of reach. The poor are bombarded by images of wealth, then sold cheap imitations. Fast food, fast entertainment, fast credit. Addiction becomes a substitute for ambition. Consumerism replaces community. Instant gratification replaces long-term change. The poor are taught to buy feelings they cannot sustain, with money they do not have. And when they fail, the system doesn't blame itself, it blames them. You're lazy. You're irresponsible. You made bad choices. But what if the game was never fair? What if the deck was stacked? What if their choices were shaped long before they had the power to choose? Here's where the mirror comes in. The poor are conditioned to blame themselves. They internalize their failure. They see their pain not as systemic, but as personal weakness. That's the ultimate Machiavellian move. Make the oppressed believe their oppression is self-inflicted. This is how power survives. Not by force, but by psychological compliance. Not by locking people up, but by locking them in to narratives, to jobs, to despair. The cycle is now complete. Education prepares them to obey. Labor ensures they're too tired to fight. Media keeps them numb and distracted. And all the while, they are told, "You are free." But freedom isn't the absence of chains. It's the presence of alternatives. In our next section, we'll step back from systems and step into the self. We'll explore how identity, shaped by trauma, survival, and generational pain, becomes a prison even more inescapable than the institutions we just examined. And how the poor, in trying to survive, often sacrifice the very self needed to break free. What happens to a person whose identity is sculpted by limitation? What becomes of the soul that is taught, over years, decades, generations, that it is less valuable, less intelligent, less capable, less deserving? This is not poverty of the pocket. This is poverty of the self. A more devastating famine. A quiet annihilation of who someone might have become. We often think of identity as something personal, something we choose. But the poor are rarely given that luxury. Their identities are formed through the lens of survival, not expression. When food, rent, and safety are uncertain, the self doesn't bloom. It contracts. It retreats into roles, masks, and hyperadaptations that serve the system but suffocate the soul. Consider the man who grew up being told his only value was hard labor. Or the woman taught that speaking softly and keeping her head down is the best way to stay out of trouble. These behaviors might keep them safe, employed, or unnoticed, but they also teach them that the full range of their personality is a liability. Over time, they no longer know who they are beyond what the system expects. This is the identity trap, the moment when survival mode becomes your default self. Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." But what happens when the conditions of life steal the tools of self-making? What if your choices are illusions, your desires are programmed, and your reflection is a mask handed to you by institutions designed to keep you tame. Identity becomes armor and also a cage. Trauma plays a central role here. Generational poverty carries with it layers of inherited pain. Abuse, addiction, abandonment, violence. These are not just individual tragedies. They are cultural patterns. Each generation passes down not just memories but mechanisms. Defense systems, hypervigilance, distrust, emotional suppression. A child growing up in poverty often absorbs these as normal, until one day, they realize that their entire personality is built on avoiding pain rather than seeking purpose. And when they try to redefine themselves, go back to school, leave a toxic job, dream bigger, they encounter resistance not just from the outside world, but from within. The self resists expansion. Why? Because new identities are unfamiliar. And in a life dominated by instability, unfamiliarity equals danger. So they sabotage, they retreat, they doubt, they relapse. And then the world points and says, "See? That's why they stay poor." But what it fails to see is the war waging inside. A war between who they are and who they were forced to become. Between the true self and the trauma-forged persona that's been rewarded for being obedient, quiet, small. Even language becomes a weapon. The poor are taught to describe themselves in limited terms. "I'm just a cook. I'm nobody. I'm not smart like them." These aren't statements of humility, they're statements of programming. And the more these scripts are repeated, the deeper the self erodes. Yet, somewhere beneath the rubble of despair, something ancient still stirs. A hunger not for wealth, but for authenticity. A desire not just to escape poverty, but to reclaim the self that poverty buried. This reclamation is not easy. It's a painful unraveling. It means mourning the false selves we wore to survive. It means confronting the terrifying possibility that the system never wanted us to truly know ourselves, because an awakened self is dangerous. It asks questions, sets boundaries, it demands more. In our next section, we'll examine those who try to escape and why most are pulled back. We'll explore the invisible gravitational pull of the old world, the guilt, the sabotage, the cultural alienation. Because to break out is not only a personal victory, it is often experienced as a betrayal. And the system has built-in consequences for betrayal. Imagine finally clawing your way out. You did the impossible. A better job, a degree, a new zip code. You stand in a space your parents only saw in advertisements, where fresh air smells like possibility instead of bus exhaust. You've escaped poverty, or so it seems. But then something strange happens. You go back to visit home, and people look at you differently. There's pride in their eyes, yes, but also distance, discomfort, a subtle tightening in conversation, as if your success became a mirror no one asked to look into. Your voice changes, your clothes change, your values evolve. You no longer laugh at the same jokes. You hesitate to bring up your new life, afraid of sounding arrogant or worse, disloyal. And this, more than poverty itself, is what no one warns you about. Escape is not just hard, it is lonely. To rise out of poverty is to risk becoming a stranger to your origin, a traitor to your class. In communities bound by shared struggle, survival becomes a sacred bond. Breaking that bond, even in pursuit of growth, can feel like betrayal. Your success becomes their loss. Your evolution becomes their alienation. And so begins the great internal war. The guilt of becoming what others couldn't, and the shame of wanting more than what you were given. Viktor Frankl, a man who survived Auschwitz, once said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But the tragedy is this: when the poor do change themselves, they often lose the only world that ever accepted them. This is why so many who escape poverty quietly self-destruct. They burn out, sabotage relationships, overspend, fall into addiction, or return, not because they failed, but because they couldn't bear the psychological cost of success. They weren't prepared for the identity rupture, the social exile, the survivor's guilt. It's not just about money, it's about belonging. Because the truth is, the system doesn't just trap the poor with barriers, it isolates the successful with silence. There are few mentors, Fewer maps. No cultural instruction manual on how to straddle two worlds without falling between them. You speak the language of both the ghetto and the boardroom, but fully belong to neither. You become a translation, a bridge, a ghost. Even within families, the tension simmers. You might be the first to go to college and suddenly your voice holds weight, but also suspicion. You think you're better now? Don't forget where you came from. These phrases are not always born of malice. Often, they are cries of grief from those who realize they've been left behind. And then there's the subconscious pull of the old world, the comfort of predictability, the familiarity of dysfunction. Poverty, for all its cruelty, can be intimate. To leave it behind is to step into the unknown. And the unknown is terrifying. So people return. Not always physically, but emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally. They choose partners who reenact their childhood chaos. They waste money to feel momentarily powerful. They dull their guilt with substances. Not because they are weak, but because they are torn. Between loyalty and liberation. Between the tribe and the self. And the system, observing from its perch, sighs with satisfaction. Because the ultimate success of poverty isn't just keeping people down. It's training them to return when they climb too high. But some resist. Some sever the rope. Not out of hatred for where they came from, but out of love for what they might become. And they carry with them a new burden. How to thrive without betraying. How to evolve without abandoning. In the final section, we will explore what true liberation looks like. Not just financial freedom, but a reclamation of the self, the story, and the soul. We will ask, how can we rebuild identity, meaning, and connection after poverty? How do we not only escape, but transform? So now the question echoes in the quiet aftermath. What does true escape look like? Not the shallow kind that ends with a promotion or a car you can't afford. Not the kind that swaps one cage for another, trading poverty for debt or silence for assimilation. But something deeper, something rarer, a rebellion not just of circumstance, but of soul. Because the final lie poverty tells you is that survival is enough. But survival is not living. It's treading water with lungs full of inherited fear. It's waking up every day with the quiet panic that you could lose everything. Again, even when you've made it, the ghosts follow, the habits, the scarcity, the deep-seated belief that joy is temporary, that rest is laziness, that failure is always one misstep away. This is the residue of generational poverty, emotional, spiritual, cultural. It clings to you long after the money changes. To truly transcend, you must do something far more radical than get rich. You must rewrite the story of who you are. This is not self-help fluff. This is psychological warfare, because reclaiming your narrative means going back to where the programming began. Unpacking the shame, confronting the rage, mourn the self you were never allowed to become. Then build again, not from fear, but from intention. True sovereignty begins where survival ends. It looks like this: saying no when your entire life taught you to say yes. Creating art not for money, but to exist. A refusing to measure your worth by productivity. Speaking in a voice you were taught to quiet. Building new definitions of success. Ones that don't rely on comparison, conquest, or external validation. It also means forgiving yourself for the ways you coped. The debt, the addiction, the burnout, the compromises, the mistakes you made while trying to breathe in a world designed to suffocate you. You were surviving. That was never weakness. That was resistance. And perhaps most urgently, it means building community, but this time not around suffering, but around liberation. Find the others who are breaking, the ones asking bigger questions, who refuse to be success stories on a leash, who are not just climbing out, but tearing down the ladder so something new can rise in its place. Because here's the truth: escaping poverty alone is a cruel paradox. You can win, but at the cost of connection. Transformation, though, that's collective. It happens when we turn survival into solidarity, when we help others climb, when we tell the truth, not the polished version. The real revolution is not in the stock market or in owning property. It's in learning to rest without guilt, to love without fear, to dream without permission. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The poor are rarely given a why. They are handed routines, burdens, debt, and guilt. But when that why is reclaimed, when meaning is resurrected from beneath the rubble, that's when the cage finally cracks. So what is your why? Is it to break the cycle for your children? To speak the truth no one else dares to voice? To prove that your worth is not defined by paychecks or prestige, but by presence, by consciousness, by the refusal to kneel before a system that profits off your silence? You don't need permission. You never did. Machiavelli's world was one of fear and manipulation. But the poor today are not pawns, they are sleeping giants. Their awakening is the system's greatest threat. Let it tremble.